Hello Year 11, this is the video for our revision booklet, all on Asia of course, and all this time on the consequences of the Korean War. So you're going to need a couple of things. No, you're not going to need a nice picture of Nigel Farage there. You're just going to need this table here, and you're going to need your consequences of the Korean War table, because obviously that's definitely going to help you out with this. So the important thing is when it comes to consequences of the Korean War, you are thinking about impacts. That's constantly what you're thinking about, and it's a key part of understanding why this Korean War was so important and the legacy that it has, because it has quite a big impact on America, Korea, Asia, the world, in fact, and it in part explains why the events in Vietnam happen later on. So although it's a little bit confusing in terms of the crossover, let's see what we can do in terms of getting this down. So let's look at North Korea first of all. Well, let's think about this in terms of the positives and the negatives. So for North Korea, well, the big positive for North Korea is that Kim still in control of the North. So Kim Il-sung is still in control of North Korea. It is still communist, which realistically was a significant win for Kim in terms of MacArthur failed to get rid of him, and communism is still in that northern area of the Korean peninsula. So what he did is he kept his dictatorship. So from a North Korean government point of view, pretty good in that respect. All right, but of course, what did he do? Is the North failed to unite Korea. And that's important because remember, that was Kim's ultimate objective when he'd crossed the 38th parallel in 1950. It is still divided at the 38th parallel to this very day. Yeah, so that's really important. In terms of the South, well, they were defended successfully against their invasion. So the South Koreans were successfully defended by the USA and indeed the UN, primarily in terms of being able to secure themselves as a non-communist government. And in the year 2025, in the 21st century, if you're watching this later on, it is actually a successful country in terms of economically, democratically now. We've moved on from the South Korea of the 1950s somewhat, although somewhat dodgy in given recent events, but ultimately it's quite a successful democratic country in terms of Southeast Asia. The losses for that, of course, they also failed to unite Korea. All right, so Syngman Rhee failed to unite Korea, just like Kim failed to unite Korea from a communist perspective. The other big thing, of course, is that, and this goes for both North and South, 4 million casualties. That is 10% of the population. So 10% of the population were either killed or wounded during the Korean War. That is a staggering amount of damage, human damage, caused by this war. So ultimately, a mixed bag for Korea. The important thing to bear in mind is it is still divided at the 38th parallel. You've got a communist North and a non-communist South, and of course there was never peace. I'm running out of room here. That peace treaty was never signed. Yes, there was an armistice signed between North and South, but there was never a peace treaty. So technically, legally, they are still at war to this very day. And that is why, to this day, there remains quite a lot of tension between North Korea and South Korea. North Korea often letting off missiles and threatening to do unspeakable things to South Korea, but fortunately, in general, not happened. They've never got themselves to a situation of direct conflict since the 1950s. Thank goodness. So what about the USA then? Well, there's winners and losers in terms of the USA and their success. And the big thing is Truman here. Yeah, so Truman, remember, wanted to contain communism, and he did. Truman contained communism, and he won a limited war. So at no point did the USA enter into an atomic war with China, for example, although China didn't have nuclear weapons then, with the USSR in particular. That's important. So Truman successfully contained communism and kept that limited war. And of course, what it meant was America were not prepared for a nuclear war. So for all the rhetoric, for all the anger that the USA said about communism and how it was a threat to freedom, they were not prepared to risk a nuclear war for this. However, politically reasonably successful, although we will come back to that next time. There was the human cost. Now, although it's the UN fighting this down here, although it's the UN, United Nations, fighting this war, there were many thousands of American troops killed in the conflict in Korea. It was a incredible human cost. If we talk politically in terms of Truman, communism was still in Asia. In North Korea, and of course in China. There were people such as MacArthur that wanted to eradicate communism. They failed to do so, partly because of America and Truman putting a stop to it, right? And of course, what you have to bear in mind is, in terms of this loss, right, the legacy felt during Vietnam. What do I mean by that? Well, if we go to our table, we've got these cold warriors here. Yeah, these cold warriors are important. What people wanted is to be tough on communism, by which I mean not giving them a bunch of flowers, shaking their hand and nicely saying, please communists, can you stop taking over countries? What they want is they want America to be giving weapons, or indeed declaring war against communists and being tough against them. Military solutions is the key to fight communism. And there were those that thought that Korea was a failure. We still had communism in North Korea, and consequently, next time around when communism threatens in Asia, America needs to do more. And that's exactly what they did, because at no point during the Korean War did US troops get put on the ground in direct conflict. Yes, US troops were there and they made a huge sacrifice, but they were fighting under the United Nations banner, not the American banner. So, what about China then? China's the big superpower that emerges here during the Korean War. Remember, when MacArthur in 1950 poked the bear, so to speak, there on the banks of the Yalu River, 180,000 People's Volunteers emerged across the Chinese-North Korean border into North Korea and drove America back to the 38th parallel. Really important, by which I mean not 180, 140,000 People's Volunteers, beg your pardon. Yeah, so they emerged as a superpower. And Mao, correct about nuclear weapons. So what do I mean? Well, he described them as a paper tiger. Yeah, they look scary. They look terrifying, of course, when you've got a weapon that's capable of obliterating millions of people within a split second, but nobody will be prepared to use them. So it looks scary, but it's a bit of paper. Effectively, it's not going to do anything at all. But what did they do? Is they threatened, or should I say, how am I going to say this? Oh, failure. Failed to get USA out of Asia. Because remember, China wanted to dominate the whole of Korea, and they failed to do so because there's still big US support for South Korea, and that's important. So, for the United Nations, well, they did what they said they would do. They defended South Korea. So this showed that the United Nations could stop aggression. So what do we mean by that? We mean if one country attacks another country, the United Nations, beg your pardon, could decisively get involved and fight for that country, and that's exactly what they did. So they successfully defended South Korea. However, the bad thing is they lost respect of communists. So if you are a communist country, you lost respect for the UN. Why? Because it was a puppet of the USA. So essentially, whatever the USA wanted the UN to do, they would do it. The bulk of the UN army was made up of US troops. So we need to bear that in mind. But of course, the USSR weren't there. They didn't have their veto, or they didn't use their veto because they were absent from the meeting that decided whether UN troops were going to go in. Because of course, what happened is the UN were refusing to recognize China here. And out of solidarity, because they were communist. And the Russians, out of solidarity, because they were friends with China, what they did is they wouldn't have anything to do with the United Nations. Missed the vote, couldn't use veto. Nevertheless, they were seen, the United Nations, as a puppet of the USA. So that, to me, looks like a lovely, completed table, effectively done for you. As you notice, on this table there is the USSR as well. You can do an extra bit section if you wanted on that. Basically, all you need to know is that it is China that emerges as the big communist power in Asia, not Stalin. That's what Stalin wanted to be, but China, by getting involved and helping Mao more enthusiastically than Stalin did, what that did is it enabled Mao to become the important person in Asia. As for the USSR, they did, however, avoid nuclear war, which is important. Yeah, okay, so that's one completed table. So that is another page of your booklet done, revising the consequences of the Korean War.